Sam Clemens, the Scamp of the Comstock. We were off to Virginia City, Kathy, my wife, and I, to follow the trail of Sam Clemens, the legendary writer, raconteur, and lecturer. Sam, as we all know, wrote under the pen name Mark Twain. Virginia City is the town that gave him his start. The town is a sad remnant of itself these days, sporting maybe 1,500 souls. That's a far cry from the great Comstock bonanza days, when millionaires rubbed shoulders with common laborers and fine ladies in magnificent landaus with matched horses bumped over the rutted streets, paying no notice to the boisterous saloons, murderous faro games, and purple-fumed opium dens. The famous Comstock was the largest gold and silver ore body ever found on Earth up to that time, ultimately yielding around $12 billion in today's dollars over a 20-year period. The bonanza was so great that it created a city in the desert built of greed, treachery, and gold fever, with a row of mansions rivaling San Francisco or Boston or Chicago, and a host of tin-roofed shanties clinging to the rocky slopes among the manzanita and sagebrush baked by the Nevada sun. From 1859 to 1879, when the supposedly inexhaustible mines began to play out, more money was made and lost in Virginia City than on Wall Street. They still mine there today, of course. That's not why people go there. Now to survive, Virginia City is a tourist attraction where cowboys and sourdoughs walk the streets ready for spur-of-the-moment gunfights, completely sanctioned by the city fathers, to reenact Virginia's colorful past. And what a past it was! In 1859, when Virginia burst upon the scene, it became the second largest city in the West after San Francisco and boasted 25,000 inhabitants, 100 saloons, and 5 churches. The seemingly endless flow of high-grade gold and silver ore that streamed out of the mountain upon which Virginia City sits held the entire world spellbound. The famous Comstock Load was the ultimate promise of America and convinced the poor of Europe that America had streets lined with gold. All you had to do was go west with shovel in hand and dig the precious ore right out of the ground. And who could blame them for thinking it? It was true. Lots of people had done it. Sod busters and seed salesmen and everyone in between had an equal chance. It was the unthinkable promise of the golden land over the horizon. The West was as far away as the moon. In those days, when the only way to communicate was a letter round the horn, it could take a year to get a letter and an answer from one coast to another. If you went west, your friends and relatives had reason to cry because they would probably never see you again. You were off to visit another world, certainly as wonderful and weird as any place you could find on the earth. And this wasn't the first time the gold bug had bit. Just 10 years before, in 1849, a gold strike in California had created such a rush to the west that more people descended on Sutter's Mill near Sacramento and the sleepy Spanish town of San Francisco de Asís, more popularly known as Mission Dolores, that it drafted all previous immigration up to that time. Within a few years, San Francisco had swollen to 25,000 miners, shopkeepers, and argonauts, and was slowly starting to become a real town. Now, just 10 years later, it was happening all over again. Around the globe, Virginia City was the topic of conversation at every dinner table, and not a little bit of sly speculation. Just like the recent technology bubble of the 1990s, which caused a stock market boom, the whole country was busy trading in the hot stocks of the various mines. A simple soul in Syracuse could be a dirt poor farmer one day, and the next be a wealthy mine owner. Of course, most often than not, it worked the other way. But Virginia did produce more millionaires than any other city in the country during those fabulous 20 years, the Bonanza years. One of the most famous of those Silver Kings was a certain John W. Mackey, an apprentice shipbuilder with a head for business, whose big Bonanza mine gushed out nearly $400 million of silver ore in only 4 years. Mackey was a silent, level-headed Irishman who kept his own counsel and invested his money wisely. He was generous to people in need, and legend has it that he spent the rest of his life giving lots of it away, mainly to the state that helped him make it, Mackey's School of Mines in Reno. At the end of the Great Mother Lode period, as he was preparing to leave town, he arranged with the bank, it is said, though I couldn't confirm it, to pay off every loan held by all the citizens of Virginia on all their property. He also paid up all the city's debt as well. It cost him just $1 million or $2 million, but since he had untold millions extra, he didn't even notice the difference. Needless to say, it made quite an impression. Is it true? Well, lots of things in Nevada are true, more or less. The longer time runs on it, the more true it seems to get. But our purpose was to trod the same ground and stand in the footsteps of one of Virginia's most famous graduates, Sam Clemens, quote, the most lovable scamp and nuisance who ever blighted Nevada, close quote. At least so said Senator William Stewart, a good friend of young Twain from Virginia City days. That's from his reminiscences he wrote in 1908. Sam's history in Virginia City is written large in the city's memory. It is where he got his start in 1862, just 3 years after the first major ore body was discovered, and Virginia was where he remained for 4 years until he left town after challenging another reporter to a duel, which was illegal. Sam had the temerity to publish the duel notice in his paper, the Territorial Enterprise, where he worked as an imaginative reporter. So the publisher thought it might be wise for him to travel further west for a bit until the heat was off. Now, don't misunderstand. Sam was not a roughneck or a bully. He was known as a lovable scallywag and rascal, mainly because of his wonderfully outlandish reporting on the news of the day. It's just that he had a hair-trigger temper and a fondness for staring into the bottom of a whiskey bottle. So he could get pretty riled if the mood was upon him. With Sam, the mood came more or less regularly and generally with colorful results. So Sam left marks in Virginia City, which we hoped, with a little effort, we could uncover, and as it turned out, we were right. Of course, every saloon keeper, souvenir shop, and ice cream store swears Mark Twain had a double scoop of Rocky Road Ripple right there just the other day. And in a way, they are right, because the town is inhabited by all kinds of cowboys in slouch hats, six-shooters and spurs, who are busy impersonating old-timey bonanza sourdoughs, cowpokes, and famous celebrities of the time, including Twain. They seem to have a right good time, shooting each other in mock gunfights and fake lynchings. The tourists have a good time, too, if they let themselves become kids again for one brief moment. Anyway, Nearly every day some Mark Twain wannabe is holding forth at Piper's Opera House and afterwards enjoying that rocky road ripple in between performances. It doesn't take much of an imagination, if you're an ice cream store owner, to stretch the truth and try to convince the tourists that old Mark sure loved this particular brand of rocky road, and anyway it pleases the children. All this fanciful history made digging into the past a real task, for we wanted to find the real Virginia City, the mighty Comstock, the Motherlow, etc. Lucky for us, lots of folks in Virginia City feel about their town just the same we do. They see the buildings and don't see the tourists. They cherish its history and want to share it with others who are really interested, and as to all the other stuff, they're inclined to be very lenient and charitable. They realize, as do I, that Virginia doesn't really have a reason to be around anymore. It only had one reason to begin with, and once that was ripped out of the ground, Virginia was left with not a reason on earth to exist. Who would want to drive out into the Nevada desert 20 miles from the nearest town on top of a couple of scraggly mountains and live, for goodness sake? Especially when the land for miles in all directions is riddled with tunnels, mine tailings, poisonous chemicals from the cyanide ore reduction process, and collapses every now and again as the old square set timbers give way. It must have been a mighty tough job to sell it as a tourist attraction, but they have, so my hat's off to them. A careful and serious attempt to save the more obvious remnants of the city is being made. The Fourth Ward School of 1876 and the Collar Mine are fixed up and available for a tour. The school prepared young minds for lofty thoughts, and the mine took young bodies and buried them underground. Mining in the 1860s was back-breaking, hot, and dangerous work. The poorest Chinese laborer was the workhorse of Virginia City, struggling underground in heat so fierce that a fit miner could not stand it for 10 minutes an hour. The riches were so tangible and tantalizing that men not only lined up for a chance to get at the golden veins that shot through the mountain, they would literally kill each other for a chance at it. The city's Boot Hill is a grim testimonial to the greed that changed ordinary citizens into murderers. But there was a remedy for the gold bug fever. The Story County Courthouse holds the original jail, a grim and graceless human storage locker that could reduce the toughest cowpoke to meek silence in minutes. And upstairs features an awe-inspiring courtroom with glowing and lovingly polished wood paneling and hard wooden seats. The judge's bench and jury box come right out of a Western movie. Except, of course, this is no movie, and Hollywood, as it usually does, was just using reality as a pattern for its fiction. If you were a defendant in the dock in that courthouse, you had reason to be worried. Justice in Nevada was swift and hard. In Virginia City, which probably had a higher percentage of drifters, grifters, liars, and gamblers than just about any place on earth during the 1870s, justice couldn't afford to be too lenient and forgiving. Even the statue of Justice above the main entrance to the fortress-like building has her eyes wide open and wears no blindfold. That statue says a lot, even though it's made of stone. Some say, and I wouldn't doubt it, that in Nevada, justice looked you right in the eye and would coldly cut you down in the prime of your life for infractions that in today's world would hardly qualify for prison time, let alone 5 very uncomfortable minutes at the wrong end of a hanging rope. Standing in that courtroom 125 years later, I was thinking about young Sam, 25 years old, 5 foot 8 inches, lean and tough from digging unsuccessfully in another boom-bust gold town, Aurora, 100 miles to the south. He had a good job, and he was glad to have it. $25 a week was a princely sum, especially for a kid with not much formal schooling. "I'm a good speller," he modestly explained as his only qualifications for the job. Yes, he could. And the yarning he did with those well-spelled words must have had something to do with his high salary. As a comparison, however, you should bear in mind that since the underground work in Virginia was some of the most dangerous on earth, the miners were the highest paid in the world at $20 a week. So Sam's verbal eloquence was rated at $5 more per week than a common laborer who sweated in the fiery pits underground, ripping into the golden ore in temperatures of 115 degrees. As Sam would say, "I do not like to work even when another person does it." Obviously, scribbling with a pen was a way to avoid sweating it out underground. Sam had had his fill of mining after spending his first year in Nevada, alternatively working for his brother, Orion, at the soon-to-be state capital in Carson City. Nevada entered the Union in 1864, and then futilely mining in Aurora. The experience in Aurora was enough to convince him to find success as the local reporter of the Territorial Enterprise in Virginia City, with the task of poking about the town and asking questions. There were several other newspapers in town during that period, and lots of, quote, news, close quote. Just not every day, of course. When you have major gold strikes occurring once a week and a shooting every other Wednesday, there was lots to report. When there wasn't anything to write about, Sam was encouraged to use his imagination. Ordinarily, this wouldn't be a problem, but with a precocious mind like Clemens possessed, this was positively lethal. I wandered about town, questioning everybody, and finding out that nobody knew anything. At the end of 5 hours, my notebook was still barren. I spoke to Mr. Goodman, the editor. He said, "Are there any hay wagons in from Truckee? If there are, you might speak of the renewed activity and all that sort of thing in the hay business, you know. It isn't sensational or exciting, but it fills up and looks businesslike." I canvassed the city again and found one wretched old hay truck dragging in from the country. But I made affluent use of it. I multiplied it by 16, brought it into town from 16 different directions, made 16 separate items of it, and got up such an awful sweat about hay as Virginia City had ever seen in the world before. This was encouraging. 2 nonpareil columns had to be filled, and I was getting along. Presently, when things began to look dismal again, a desperado killed a man in a saloon, and joy returned once more. I never was so glad over any mere trifle before in my life. I said to the murderer, "Sir, you are a stranger to me, but you have done me a kindness this day which I can never forget. If whole years of gratitude can be to you any slight compensation, they shall be yours. I was in trouble, and you have relieved me nobly at a time when all seemed dark and drear. Count me your friend from this time forth, for I am not a man to forget a favor." If I did not really say that to him, I at least felt to a sort of itching desire to do it. I wrote up the murderer with a hungry attention to details, and when it was finished, I experienced but one regret, namely, that they had not hanged my benefactor on the spot, so that I could work him up too. That's from Roughing It, chapter 42. Such egregious liberty with the truth would be frowned upon in today's antiseptic world, but in the days before instantaneous communication, web surfing, and television's 24-hour news channels, the ability to get your words put into print was equivalent to a license to steal. Anything you said could hardly be corroborated, so why bother with being accurate with the truth when the imagined truth was probably closer to a real thing anyway? One of those facts which completely lack corroboration, and probably always will, is the origin of the most familiar pen name in all of literature, the famous name of our subject, Mark Twain. We have all heard the romantic story of the Clemens riverboat years on the steamy, muddy Mississippi, with steamboat whistles and the slap, slap, slap of the ever-turning side wheelers. The treacherous water of the river had to be carefully watched, since every sandbar had a nearly magnetic affinity for rivercraft. To avoid such potentially career-destroying events, a mate on board had the task of measuring the depth of the river with a knotted rope tied to a lem plumb bob. Mark 1 was a measure of 1 knot on the rope, and, you guessed it, Mark Twain was a measure of 2 knots on the rope. Well, it's a mighty fine story, which has stuck around because it seems so romantic and comfortable. It brings to mind a leisurely cruise down the Mississippi, with the moon hanging low on the horizon, filtered through the Spanish moss, dripping cobweb-like from the water oaks that line the bank. The problem is, of course, that it makes little sense to name yourself after a knot on a rope. Now, some will say that it means clear sailing and plenty of water under your keel. Well, of course it does. But still, why would an author decide that a measurement was a name that anyone would care about? George Williams III, in his book On the Road with Mark Twain, has a much more satisfying explanation to my mind. Mark Twain, as it turned out, was Sam Clemens' nickname in Virginia City. Unfortunately for the romance lovers of the world, the origin of that nickname turns out to be somewhat less endearing than moonlight cruises over the lovely, sprawling Father of the Waters. Besides owning the Opera House, John Piper had the Old Corner Saloon, which is one of the favorite hangouts for Sam Clemens and the other Virginia City scribblers. Clemens, being the sociable sort that he was, and loving the bottle, took pains to rarely, if ever, drink alone. So he was always in the company of one or more equally sociable reporters. He ordered drinks for himself and his pal, and since he was a regular, had a regular account. He'd settle up on a regular basis, and these days, before sales tax, beverage tax, luxury tax, or any tax for that matter, would be carried by Piper from payday to payday, with a reliance on Piper marking down the number of drinks he'd ordered. Clemens would just call out to Piper how many, and Piper would mark it down. If it were 2, as it most frequently was, Piper would write, Mark, you guessed it, Twain. After enough time, with Clemens calling out Mark Twain for 2 drinks, he picked up the name Old Mark Twain, the 2-drink-at-a-time character. Mark Twain was the name of his youth, of good times and frivolity with men he liked and a profession he loved. When he turned his scribbling skill into his own form of gold, Clemens looked back on those fond years of his youth and called himself Mark Twain. No, it's not as romantic as knots on a rope, if you happen to find knotted ropes romantic, but it sure feels like the kind of thing the scamp of the Comstock would love to do. A man who could make an avalanche of hay out of a single hay wagon could certainly get a chuckle or 2 out of his loyal readers, swallowing whole Mark Twain as a romantic handle. We found that Old Corner Saloon right across the street from the courthouse on the first floor of Piper's Corner, above which is Piper's Opera House, which at that time shared the spotlight with McGuire's Opera House. Yes, they had opera then, but they also had a rough and rowdy vaudeville and minstrel show as well. Some days the swells from up B Street would come down with their ladies for a bit of culture, provided by David Belasco, with legendary performers such as the Booths, the Barrymores, and Lily Langtry. History crosses you up a bit because as the years roll on, things change. The Piper's I stood in was built after Twain was long gone from town. As a matter of fact, not much of the Twain-era town actually is in its original box, as it were. In a town at 6,200 feet, the winters are mighty cold. Everyone heated their house with wood stoves. Wherever you have thousands of citizens throwing logs on the fire, you have a high probability that somewhere someone is going to tote out the ashes with live embers hidden among the dead coals. And when that happens, in a wood shanty that's been dried in the Nevada sun, you have an instant conflagration. It happened on a regular basis in Virginia City. In 1875, the whole town burned down, except for a few mansions along Millionaire Road. Pipers went up in flames like just about everything else, including the Territorial Enterprise and the courthouse. So the Pipers of today was built in 1885, having burned to the ground in 1875 and 1883. It makes little difference since they built right on the ashes of the old building. As a matter of fact, it makes it downright convenient, since when I was there, the University of Nevada was deep into the corner bar with brush and shovel, sifting through a dark line of ash from the fire of 75, the big bonfire they call it locally. From among the ash and rubble, I saw them extract an ornately carved black meerschaum pipe. It had black forest carving. Kathy immediately noted the style and mentioned it to the dig superintendent. It struck a nerve. You know, she said, John Piper was from Germany and a pipe smoker to boot. Could it be? Here among the dust and ash and rock is a half-broken pipe bowl that could have been held by Piper himself. I tried to see him behind his bar in this dark little room with the Nevada sun blazing away outside and the dark, smoky interior that smelled perhaps of whiskey and beer and strong Virginia tobacco from Piper's meerschaum and Twain's equally smelly pipe, the one that emitted such foul smells that the Enterprise crew dubbed it the Remains. The air was filled with loud laughter and the hurrahing of the reporters of the various town newspapers, dodging the work at the office and making up knee slappers to put in the evening edition. John was laughing along with all the rest at one of Sam's outrageous stories and rocking back with glee as Sam launched into one of his colorful curses for which he was so justly famous. Why, the quadrilateral astronomical incandescent son of a bitch! He would croon when sufficiently worked up and lubricated, and the whole bar would roar with astonishment at the liberal fireworks which Clemens could summon up so effortlessly. It was that very eloquence which only 10 years hence would make him the toast of the world, and the most celebrated writer America has ever produced. We lost Mark Twain and Sam Clemens both in 1910. He was 74. He loved the brimstone country around Virginia City, and I do too. It's not a pretty sight now, it probably never was, but it positively vibrates with the nearness of our raucous, anxious, driving American historical past. In my imagination, the now still piano tinkles familiar tunes from the silent saloons, and the liars, gamblers, and thieves have all gone to their well-justified fiery reward. America has grown up a bit from the days when you could sink a spade into the earth and come up with a year's pay in gold nuggets. But somehow it's nice to know that it happened once, and it still happens today to entrepreneurs and garage workshops every day. Virginia City wasn't polite, and she wasn't very sophisticated for all the airs the old girl put on. And now, after her youth is gone, she's definitely showing her age. But to be fair, she wasn't given very much beauty to start with, you know. There's hardly a tree or a scrub to soften her, but somehow she has a beauty in the very starkness of her existence. A town built on a mountain of gold and silver. A more improbable place you never could find. Sam Clemens loved the place. She fitted him right down to the ground. Why don't you come on out and see if she fits you too?